The 576th edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
And that could make a difference. Lawson at the buzzer. Maybe not. Ty Lawson wins it at the buzzer.
Deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a
coach. Gets the roll. Here we go. Page has it. Carolina down 1. 84-83. Page into the front court with 4 seconds. Page to the rim. Got it! He got it! 9/10 of a second to go. Inbounds. Washington gets it to Warren. His full court shot. No good. Marcus Page baby. Does it for the Tar Heels. Carolina wins it.
Don't force it if you're Goss.
Comes in. Blocked by Meeks. Buried up ahead to Jackson. And he tucks it down for the 5-point lead. Matthews off the mark. And this year, the confetti is going to fall for North Carolina. They're not going to be denied this time. Inside 30 overall. Love, top of the key. Oh! Big time delivery.
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome into another edition of the Four Corners podcast here on a Thursday night. Josh and Anthony here with you guys. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. And tonight we continue our off-season series, the What If series, where we're talking about the biggest what ifs in Carolina basketball decade by decade. We've gone through the 1950s. We've gone through the 1960s. Tonight we will tackle the 1970s, a fun decade, but one that, there's some questions with if things would have gone a different way, just how differently could this Carolina basketball program look and felt back then, and how that would have changed the course that the program would go on towards. It's now, in our opinion, established itself as the best program in all of college basketball. So we'll do that in just a moment. Before we do that, we start every edition of the pod as we always do with the pod thought of the day. Go to Albert Einstein for that pod thought, and that thought is, quote, learn from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow. The important thing is not to stop questioning, end quote. I think that's very applicable for where Carolina basketball is right now. Hubert Davis and his coaching staff trying to learn from the mistakes of the past year while doing so in the present with a hope for really getting back to where this program is supposed to be, which is atop the ACC and atop the national polls. And the best way to do that is to not stop questioning and really trying to find ways to better yourselves as individuals and in the team setting. It's what I think made Coach Smith so great. It's what made Coach Williams so great, was they never stopped questioning how they could improve the program. And I think the same could be said now for Hubert Davis, who enters a big year here in year 5 as he looks to establish himself as the longtime leader of Carolina basketball.
Yeah, I think that certainly is, where he's at this point. I definitely believe that heading into this year, Hubert is looking at this as, really his final shot. It's amazing, and we're going to get to it probably in the what if series of, what ends up happening if he wins that national championship. But yeah, this feels like this is really the final shot for him. And I think he's, at this point, you can't question where you're at. You've got to look at it as this is the situation that we're dealing with. Now it's about moving forward. And I think he does have hope for this upcoming season. I think, it's easy to look at this group and say that it doesn't necessarily match up talent-wise to some of the groups that we've seen in years past. But, again, Carolina did so much overhauling to this roster. 10 new guys now on this roster with Ivan Matalakovic now a part of the group. So, I mean, this is, a group that is trying to turn the page on what Carolina has been the last few years, turn this thing in the right direction. And I do think that we have, as we've been talking about, especially with Luka Bogovac now looking like he's going to be a part of what Carolina does this season, we feel like Carolina's in a pretty good spot to be able to answer some of those questions that are still on the horizon for the program overall.
Yeah, most certainly. And we're getting closer and closer to finding out the answers to those questions. We're already, it's the first full week of August, but classes start in just under 10 days, and practice starts in just under 6 weeks. And before you know it, this team will be, on a plane to go, scrimmage against BYU. And before you know it, we'll be in the season opener, and we'll be right in the thick of the season and learning all about this year's team. And we certainly cannot wait for that. But in the meantime, we'll continue with the off-season series that I think has been a lot of fun, been very popular with the audience, and that's been the What If series, tackling the biggest questions in the history of Carolina basketball decade by decade. And, the 1950s, Carolina emerges as a national program, winning a national title in 1957. At the end of the 1960s, Dean Smith established his presence within the ACC, within the sport, going to 3 straight Final Fours. I think the 1970s is when Carolina established itself as a national staying power, and quite literally ever since then, they have not left the scene. Multiple Final Fours. They played in another national championship game. They won an NIT tournament, which back then was just as prestigious as the NCAA tournament. And so this is really where I think Carolina cemented itself as one of the premier programs in the sport. And that sentiment, that feeling in and around Chapel Hill has not left some 50-odd years later. With that, there was a lot of things that kind of that if things would have gone differently, maybe some things happen in a bigger way for Carolina than what just initially took place in the 1970s. And we'll start off in 1971, which was the year that Carolina would win the NIT. They would beat Duke and they beat Georgia Tech in the semifinals and the finals, respectively. So when Carolina played Duke in the Final Four, that was the first time they had met in the NCAA tournament. Was not the first time those two programs had met in a tournament setting outside of the ACC tournament, because they met all the way back in the 1971 NIT. But Carolina, won the ACC that regular season. They went 11-3 in the conference, but they fell to South Carolina in the ACC tournament and were excluded from the NCAA tournament that year. Back then you had to win the tournament to automatically qualify. The tournament expansion had started to take place, but it wasn't always a guarantee that you would get multiple teams into the tournament field. And so my simple question when you look at this team in particular, is if they win the ACC tournament, that of course gets them a bid into the NCAA tournament. With what they did going on to win the NIT, is it fair to say, is it safe to say that if Carolina would have won the ACC tournament, would they had gone to the Final Four that year, which would have been their 4th Final Four in 5 years under Coach Smith?
Yeah, I mean, it's very possible that that's what ends up happening. I don't think it's a guarantee. I mean, you go back to the 1971, and we're talking about the 1971 NCAA tournament, not the 1971-72 season for Carolina, where they would make it to the NCAA tournament. So, I mean, look, clearly, I don't think you're picking them to win the national championship. This was still during the heydays of UCLA, a team that was very successful during that time. Kansas also, a team that had a lot of success during that time. But you look at some of the other teams that, were in the Final Four, teams that made these deep runs. Villanova was a team that made a deep run in this tournament. And same thing with Western Kentucky, I think there's a good chance that, Carolina could have ended up making it to the Final Four. It's not a given, but I do think that with the success that they had in the NIT tournament, you feel pretty good about that. I mean, look, wasn't the highest scoring team that Carolina had, wasn't the greatest rebounding team that Carolina ever had, but you had 4 NBA players on this roster. You had a young George Karl, and then some upperclassmen in Dennis Wychuk and Bill Chamberlain, who actually, passed away recently after, a long life for him, and one, a guy that probably doesn't get talked about enough from Carolina, his time at Carolina. Those were 2 guys that were leading the team during that season. So, I mean, yeah, I think Carolina, they were a team that scored almost 13 more points per game than their opponents. I mean, averaged 84.6 points per game, which was one of the better marks in all of college basketball that season during that time. And so I think Carolina probably does end up making a run. I don't know if it's guaranteed that they make it to the Final Four, but I do think you would feel pretty good about their chances to make it there.
And the reason why I put the Final Four label is because that's the holy grail of the sport, and the significance of if they make the Final Four that year, then that would have given Coach Smith, 12 Final Fours in his career, putting him one behind Coach K, tying him with the legendary John Wooden. And so not that 11's anything to be upset about. It's anything to scoff at, but we can always be greedy. You can always want more. You put him up there with 12 Final Fours, it really strengthens his argument for him being, among the greatest 4 basketball coaches in the history of college basketball, which we certainly believe that. It's just one of those things where if you have another Final Four to your ledger, it's really hard to kind of tear apart and tear down the accomplishments. And I also think like that was a team that had they made the Final Four and not won the national championship, I think that's one of the more forgivable teams that, you could have looked at that didn't cut down the nets, but still look at it and say they achieved a great deal. I think if there's something that, we've always talked about when we debate where he ranks among the all-time greats, whether it's in Carolina basketball history or in the history of the sport, is there were some teams that he had that, quite frankly, should have made the Final Four and didn't, or when they got to the Final Four, should have won the national championship and didn't. And that wasn't always the case with, our guy Roy Williams. It wasn't the case for Coach K really until the back end of his career when he went to the one and done model. But that was something that the Dean Smith did kind of have to endure, where he built great teams that had some failures in March, whether it was before the Final Four or whenever they got to the Final Four in that respective year. Still nothing to be upset about. As I mentioned, in 1971, you still had schools that opted to go the NIT route over the NCAA tournament. The tournament, in terms of the NCAA, was starting to grow more popular, and it was starting to be the one that these teams opted to go in. But the NIT was still a big deal. And so when Carolina won it, it was a sign to the college basketball world that they were not going anywhere, because you still had to beat quality competition if you wanted to win that event. It also, with it being held, exclusively at MSG in New York City, was a big part of helping Carolina kind of reestablish its national recruiting footprint, kind of what they had there under Frank McGuire. And so while that team that actually, play in the NCAA tournament, that 1971 team that won the NIT was a big part of what the program did achieve throughout the entire decade. Whereas I mentioned in the setup, this is the decade where Carolina really established itself as a national program, and that has been the case ever since. The next what if is going to be, I'm not going to say it's going to be difficult to talk about. There's going to be some tongue-in-cheek, though, because we got to give props to an NC State Wolfpack guy, but I can make this all about Carolina. And the what if is, what if David Thompson had attended Carolina? Of course, he played at NC State, led NC State to a national championship. The Wolfpack had a run of 57-1 over a 2-year span. The old ACC heads would tell you that he's the greatest ACC player of all time. I argue that what Tyler Hansbrough did over the span of 4 years in a deeper conference than what David Thompson did in the 1970s is still more impressive. And so I give the nod to Psycho T over David Thompson. But there's no denying that, if Carolina could have gotten him to Chapel Hill, there would have been some major ramifications. And so the what if that I have for his for this situation is quite simply, if David Thompson would have enrolled at UNC and played his college basketball at Carolina and played his college basketball for Coach Smith, do they win a national championship during his college career?
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. Now, the thing is that if you look at his career, which spanned from 1973, which would be the 1972-73 season, to the 1974-75 season. What is the best Carolina team during that stretch? Well, it's the 1973-74 squad that went 22-6 on the season. That one, without Phil Ford. Now, Phil Ford eventually becomes a part as a freshman of that 74-75 team. So maybe that's the one that you think has a better chance to succeed. But, I think if he's there, does it guarantee them a national championship? No. But would it have guaranteed them probably at least a Final Four appearance? I think yes. He was arguably the most talented player in the history of the conference up until Tyler Hansbrough got to the court in 2005. I mean, you look at his numbers, they were just absolutely ridiculous, even for that time frame. Now, there are some Carolina players that we, have talked about before. Billy Cunningham is one of them that put up numbers that were very similar in terms of just the gaudiness of the stats. But, I mean, this was a guy that led the team and I believe led the nation in scoring in 1973, 74, and 75. His final year averaged 29.9 points per game, 8.2 rebounds per game. He was a 3-time first-team All-American, 2-time AP Player of the Year. He was as good as it got when it came to playing in the ACC, especially back in the 70s. And so I think if you add him to Carolina's roster, it puts you in a great spot to be able to succeed. I think maybe because, based off of the fact that we know what Phil Ford eventually becomes, that season as a freshman, he averaged 16.4 a game, 5.2 assists per game. You also had, Mitch Kupchak, who was around him, Walter Davis, who was there as well, Tommy Lagarde at center, who would be an NBA player. And then on the bench, John Kuster. So you wonder if Carolina has him. First of all, somebody's probably not there. So who are you subtracting from that equation? Maybe that ends up being Walter Davis because he was a sophomore. Wouldn't have necessarily needed to bring him in if you had David Thompson already there. I think that's probably a team that challenges to win a national championship where they do end up going to the NCAA tournament and end up finishing third place that season. So I think that certainly is the year that you're looking at and saying that could have been Carolina's chance to win a national championship right there if they had him. So I'm not going to guarantee it, but I'm going to tell you there would have been a really good shot for the Tar Heels to cut down the nets at the end of that 74-75 season.
Yeah, I think, it's a real hard thing to, project. I just find it hard to think that if he could win a national championship at NC State, that he wouldn't have won a national championship at North Carolina. But, with the way that Carolina did operate back then, there is maybe a scenario where the conversation that was always held around Michael Jordan being held back by playing for Dean Smith, maybe that same conversation would have existed around David Thompson. And this is really like the height of the Carolina State rivalry and what old Carolina fans, remember when they talk about this being the premier rivalry in the conference. And these are what NC State fans hold on to the most is, what David Thompson did. Because I was going back and just looking at some notes and some stats from this time in the rivalry. It's hard to imagine with all the success we've seen Carolina have against the Wolfpack. They played NC State 9 times over a span of 1973 to 1975, where 7 times they were ranked inside the top 10 and 4 times they were ranked inside the top 5. And Carolina lost all 9 of those games by an average of 5.3 points per game. In 6 of those 9 games, the margin was 4 or less. I mean, could you imagine if we existed back then and we had to record a podcast about that type of about those high magnitude of games that Carolina was close in but never got over the hump? I mean, look at how we are when Carolina loses to Duke, when Duke is clearly the better team, like this past year when Duke beat us 3 times. And all 3 times I came on this podcast in utter distraught having to talk about that. We've been blessed not to talk about too many losses to NC State, but look how overreactive we are, how emotional we are when we get beat by State. And the State teams that have beaten us in years past, outside of the one that beat Carolina in the ACC tournament final, those weren't teams to really write home about. And think about the vitriol and the anger that comes with talking about those games. I could not imagine having to talk about losing or having to do 9 straight losing podcasts to them and pretty much top 10, top 5 matchups all time. And the one common denominator is that David Thompson was wearing red instead of Carolina blue. And so I think it's one of the biggest, it's a what if for Carolina. I think it's the biggest what ifs like in ACC history because, he helped elevate the NC State program to a national program under Norm Sloan, something they hadn't been, after Everett Case had moved on. He played in maybe the greatest college basketball game of all time between Maryland, when that was a 1 versus 2 matchup, and you had Tommy Burleson leading the Terrapins, and they played a 103-100 overtime game. And so we can look at David Thompson's impact and look at it directly at Carolina. But if he would have gone to UNC, it directly impacts the entire outlook for the conference, because if you put him in Chapel Hill, he's playing for, I guess at that time, the second most premier program in the country with what NC State would accomplish. And I just find it hard to fathom that had he been in Chapel Hill for 3 years, they would not have at least gotten to the Final Four. And maybe, just maybe, they would have found a way to take down the UCLA juggernaut and win a national championship themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is you needed a player during that time that would have, been able to sort of do everything himself, would have been an unstoppable player. And that's what it felt like he was. And, for Carolina, I mean, this was one that got away. He was a guy that was from Shelby, so it wasn't like he was an out-of-state guy that Carolina maybe didn't have a shot at. Maybe they weren't recruiting him at that time. No, this was an in-state guy that Carolina had a shot to get, and NC State just ended up landing him, and he turns into one of the greatest players to ever play in the ACC. So I think it is fair to ask that question. Would Carolina have been able to win a national championship with him out there? Yeah, getting over that UCLA hump would have been very difficult. You also had, Kentucky during that time that was very successful, Louisville. Syracuse is a team that made the Final Four that year that I referenced. Actually, Carolina was eliminated. They finished 3rd place in the East Regional. That's how it was, because they used to have 3rd place games for your regions as well. So, Carolina came up short there, but you wonder if you have that type of generational player, how much of a difference does it make? Does it give you an extra round or 2, or does it ultimately put you over the top? I think there's a pretty good chance that it could have put Carolina over the top, especially when you combine. I mean, if him and Phil Ford had played together, you talk about 2 Carolina greats playing together, that would probably be one of the best combinations that we had ever seen in Carolina history. And who knows, maybe David Thompson is regarded as the best player to ever play for Carolina. That would certainly be an interesting argument, I think, if he had won a national championship for the Tar Heels, very similar to what Tyler Hansbrough did. So it's a conversation that we can have, thankfully. And, I'm glad that we don't have that type of argument because I think we would probably both be still on the side of Tyler Hansbrough and we'd be getting yelled at by the fan base. But at the same time, it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened had Carolina been able to turn that recruitment in their favor and land him.
If you want more backstory, more detail, more firsthand accounts about his recruitment, I encourage y'all, if you haven't, you have to go watch the ACC Network documentary about the ACC tournament. There's pretty much a whole episode dedicated to how David Thompson got to NC State. There was a penalty that, kept them from playing in the NCAA tournament. So go figure, they land the best player in the history of that program. And they did so with an NCAA violation attached to it. But, it details that and then just his overall impact on the conference. So it's probably the best piece of production the ACC Network has ever put out. And if you want to learn more about the history of the conference as a whole, I do encourage you, if you haven't, to go back and watch that documentary sometime here in the off season. The next what if is directly tied to a guy that you mentioned, which was Phil Ford. For some people, he's on the Mount Rushmore of Carolina basketball players. For some people, he's on the Mount Rushmore of ACC players. And when we look at Phil Ford, we'll have a twofold what if for him to kind of wrap up this edition of the podcast as we're taking a look at the biggest what ifs from the 1970s. We'll start with the biggest what if that it revolves around him. And that, of course, is 1977, where Carolina loses in the NCAA tournament final. They get back to the Final Four. They advance to the national championship game, falling to Marquette in a game where, Phil Ford played with a hyperextended elbow. Pretty much was, I don't want to say useless on offense, but was pretty much non-effective, was a non-factor on the offensive end of the court, and it took Carolina's offense completely out of rhythm. You're talking about a team that averaged, well over 80 points per game. They scored just 59 in the title loss because the offense just could not adapt to Phil Ford not being at 100%. And so pretty point blank, pretty simple what this what if is going to be. But if Phil Ford would have been healthy in 1977, do we believe that Carolina emerges victorious and they get Dean Smith's first national championship 5 years earlier than that would happen in 1982?
Yeah, I certainly think that ends up being the case. You're talking about Marquette, who wasn't exactly a powerhouse during that season. You look at them, 25-7 overall, solid, but not anything great, not anything spectacular. Now, the one thing that I will say that is interesting about them is you would say, okay, well, the reason why Carolina did not score why they didn't score the ball well in that game was because they did not have Phil Ford. You got to give some credit to Marquette as well, because during that season, they did allow just 59.4 points per game, which was the second best mark in the entire country. So they were a really good defensive team. But you would imagine, Carolina loses that game by 8. You'd imagine with a healthy Phil Ford, a guy that averaged 18.7 points per game that season, that he would have been a much bigger factor in that game, and Carolina would have been able to pull out the victory. A loaded squad for Carolina that season. They had so much size to go along. Just some great players. Walter Davis, Mike O'Kern, as well as Tommy Lagarde, who was still there for Carolina during that time. Very senior-laden squad, very veteran squad, and just so much NBA talent. So you would imagine that Carolina finds a way to win that national championship, even if it was a little bit uglier. And yeah, that gives Dean Smith that title a little bit earlier. And you would imagine that with the pressure off, he is able to still win the 82 title, maybe able to win, some more titles along the way. I think that certainly comes into play for Carolina. As, go back to the 81 title game. You wonder, with the pressure off there, do they end up finding a way to beat Indiana in that title game? I mean, if that happens, he's got 2 more NCAA titles to his name. We're talking about him as the greatest coach to ever coach in college basketball history. So very unfortunate, but guess what? Name of the game when it comes to Tar Heel point guards, it seems like moving forward, we see so many examples of the Tar Heels star point guards getting banged up in the NCAA tournament or right before the NCAA tournament, and it leads to them either struggling to get past certain opponents and sparking runs to a national title, or it leads to Carolina getting eliminated because they don't have certain guys out there. This was really where that trend started, and unfortunately, a sad one that they ran into way too many times.
Yeah, this is one that I think if Phil Ford is Phil Ford, which is, arguably, if he's healthy, he's the best player on the floor. I think it's hard to envision Carolina losing. They had played so well leading up to, that loss, into against Marquette. They'd won 15 straight games. So they were the hottest team in the country. And, as we know, with having watched Carolina basketball under Roy Williams, it hasn't changed under Hubert Davis, and it all dates back to Coach Smith's time. The point guard is the most important person on the floor for Carolina. It's not always the best player, but it's always the most important, because that's what, they're the guy that gets Carolina into their sets. That's he's the extension of the head coach on the court, calls out the defense, what have you. And Phil just not being at his best was a big factor in this loss to, a Marquette team that, unfortunately, I don't think gets as much love and recognition for them actually winning a national championship. Al McGuire's name is on their court when they play their home games at the Fiserv Forum, but a lot of people, relate to him more as a broadcaster than him being a guy that won a national championship on the sidelines before he got into broadcasting. So, this is one that I think, of all the teams that Coach Smith got to the Final Four and did not win a national championship before 1982, I think this one hurts the most because of how important Phil Ford was. And Phil Ford is for a lot of people that are, in their 50s or early 60s, this is their favorite player. Like that's their Marcus Page, that's their Joel Berry, that's their RJ Davis, was Phil Ford. And so the way that, I feel about those guys now that, didn't win a national championship, that's how older Carolina fans feel when it comes around Phil Ford. And this was really the tournament that started the bad injury luck. And it's something that it feels like every time Carolina has, gone on a tournament run, or they've had a tournament run cut short, you can look at injuries as to being a big reason why. Of course, you had, Kenny Smith in the 1980s. You had, Kendall Marshall in 2012. And those are just a few instances that come to the top of the brain that, you're talking about teams that, maybe didn't achieve as much as they wanted to or were expected to in March, but they have the caveat of a major injury playing a factor as to why that team that particular year did not do what it was supposed to do. The other what if that I have attached to Phil Ford is with his arrival, it was really where you look at the great lineage of point guard play that this program has produced since then. Because you'll go Phil Ford, you'll hear Jimmy Black, you'll hear Kenny Smith, you'll get to, Ed Cota, then it really goes up a notch under Roy Williams, Felton, Lawson, Marshall, Page, Barry, Kobe White, Cole Anthony, and then, recruited Caleb Love, a guy that hit one of the most important shots in the history of the program. So the second what if that I have attached to Phil Ford is, what if it's the opposite of David Thompson? What if he would have gone somewhere else? He was a Rocky Mountain native, so an in-state product. But what if Phil Ford would have went to play college basketball somewhere else? Does Carolina still become this perennial point guard program we know it to be today?
I mean, I don't know. I think that's a heck of a question. I think there's still a chance that Carolina ends up becoming this great program in terms of the point guards that they produce. Once you get Kenny Smith, I think that's probably where you would look at the lineage starting right there. And I think you could even somewhat attribute that maybe to Michael. But who knows if they end up becoming what they become. Maybe they become more known for their big guys. And look, I think Carolina's history with bigs is still just about as good as anybody's out there. But, Brad Daugherty is the guy that, it's the star probably of the 80s at that point. If for some reason, let's say Kenny Smith doesn't end up coming to Carolina. And so if that ends up happening, then, I think you're really talking about a lot of the big men. And it makes sense because even under Roy Williams, you look at the success that the bigs had. And I mean, Tyler Hansborough, the greatest player in program history, in our minds, is a guy that is a big man as well. And I think, if Phil Ford isn't here, it's pretty clear that then the two greatest players in program history to this point are probably big men. It's probably Hansborough and Lenny Rosenbluth, and those are probably your guys. So I definitely think that that is a great question to ask. Does Carolina end up getting these guys that eventually turn them into point guard U? And here's the thing, maybe then when Roy Williams eventually gets there, maybe Roy starts that up and you do have a guy, because remember, you had a holdover in Raymond Felton that was recruited by Coach Matt Daugherty. So I think that he certainly would have kept that going moving forward, especially once he saw the success that Felton had. You land a guy like Ty Lawson, and once you have Ty Lawson, that was really where it's like, okay, we need to make sure that year after year we are recruiting one of the best point guards in the country, because look at what this can unlock for us. So I think maybe it happens under Roy, but you do kind of wonder if under Dean, Carolina is remembered for their big men almost exclusively, as opposed to being remembered for not only their big men, but a combination of their big men and their point guards.
Yeah, it's really hard to not envision Carolina still recruiting and bringing in great big-time guards, because they were recruiting at that point. I mean, it was a national recruiting program. They could go anywhere in the country and get about just any player they wanted. But there's always the guy that started it all, that gets a lot of the credit for creating the environment that would come behind him, and that's Phil Ford. He's the guy that really started it all in terms of Carolina becoming a program that produced great point guards. He was a part that really helped Carolina elevate itself into a national staying power, because he was the first guy to play 4 years. Because he was the first guy to play as a freshman and then stay through his entire time. And so I still think it probably happens just because of where Carolina was able to recruit at. But I think it's more backdated to where it's probably Kenny Smith is the guy that we mentioned first, where now he's probably the name you mentioned second, because Jimmy Black was not just he wasn't a dynamic point guard. He was a prototypical point guard back then that, did the little things, got his teammates involved, but, was not, the best player on the floor, if you will. So, while it's fun to think about, David Thompson being in a Carolina uniform, it's not fun to think about Phil Ford not being in the Carolina uniform, just because all he's responsible for. I mean, he's the guy that unlocked the offense that this very podcast is named after. Like, Carolina had dabbled in the four corners offense. It was really just a delay tactic, a stall tactic, because there was not a shot clock. We could thank Coach Smith for the arrival of the shot clock, but it did not become what it became until Phil Ford arrived, where it was an offense that, maybe Carolina would go to if they wanted to hold the ball and protect the lead, but it was also an offense that they would go to get the best shot selection. And so he was a big part in that as well. And so, he's at the very fabric, at the very core of what this program was back then, what this program is today. and what this program will be moving forward, because you cannot talk about Carolina basketball and not mention the name Phil Ford. He's one of the rare players that, despite never having won a national championship, has always and will forever be synonymous with the program in Chapel Hill. Is there anything else from the 1970s that you think I'm leaving out that maybe we should tackle? Because, people are going to mention the 8 points in 17 seconds comeback. And well, what if that doesn't happen? I don't want to say that it would be minuscule, but at the time, the Carolina-Duke rivalry was not the rivalry in the conference. As I mentioned when we talked about David Thompson and had he come to Carolina, Carolina's big rival, their main rival was NC State. Their primary rival was NC State. Yes, they finished the season with Duke, but at that time, the rivalry for Carolina within the conference was with the Wolfpack. So it would be hard to not have that moment in Carolina's side on the rivalry. But I didn't that's not one when I was putting together this decade. I don't think that had really extracurricular circumstances, because even if that game doesn't happen, if that comeback doesn't happen, we know with what the 1980s bring, the arrival of Coach K, ESPN becoming a national television platform, the rivalry was going to be elevated. So I feel validated in not putting that on the list for the 1970s what-ifs.
Well, and the other thing is, I don't think there's any sort of dominance from Duke if Carolina doesn't end up winning that game. I don't think we're talking about the type of dominance that NC State had against them during that one stretch. So I think it's minuscule is maybe a little strong, because that is an iconic moment, but it certainly isn't a moment that I think just disrupts everything that Carolina does. The only other one that I had was, you go back to 1971-72, Carolina comes very close to winning a national championship behind Bob McAdoo, a guy that should be referred to probably as Carolina's greatest transfer ever. 19.5 points per game, 10.1 rebounds per game, is a first-team All-American. So if they win the national championship that year, how is Bob McAdoo remembered? Is he remembered as one of the greatest players that Carolina has ever had? Is it remembered as one of the greatest seasons that we've ever seen from a Carolina player? I think it probably is, and probably would be talked about more, because he seems to be a guy that, in hindsight, when you look at it, and you look at, some of the greatest bigs in the history of the program, it seems like his name kind of gets left off a lot of those lists. So, I mean, that would be the only one that I would point to in the 1970s and say, a big what if there. What if he wins that national championship? Is he up there in Carolina lore?
I think you're talking about him more, maybe not one of the greatest players, but if we ever were to do the best one-off seasons in Carolina history, I definitely think he's, probably right there at the front of the list. Brandon Wright's a name that really comes to mind as a one-and-done freshman. Cole Anthony never really got to get there because of an injury. Of course, Kobe White is a guy that gets talked about a lot for where he, especially considering he wasn't even the top-rated recruit that joined the program that year. So greatest players it's really hard, because I think this is a program that you really value there being multiple years of production. But if they win a national championship, I think greatest transfer, which would be very apropos for where we are right now, where Carolina just added, 10 new players, 6 directly from the transfer portal and an international pro, along with 3 incoming freshmen. So he'd be the best transfer and have arguably the most productive one season in Chapel Hill, because he could say he hung a banner, which is not something that Brandon Wright's 1 year in Chapel Hill. That team did not do it. Of course, Kobe White's team didn't. And Cole Anthony's, as great as he was individually, it was a 14-19 team. It's hard to talk about him in a positive light with just how bad Carolina was as a whole. So that's probably where I would go. And it's a great name to point out. I think it's a name that does get forgotten about by Carolina fans, because he did just play 1 year. And there's no doubt that if he would have been on a team that wins a national championship, I do think that it really does elevate his status as one of the best players in the history of the program clearly maybe the best individual one-off season that we've seen in Carolina basketball history. So, this was fun, man. The deeper we go, first off, the easier it is to talk about because there's more information available. But also there's just some storylines that are fun to go back and reminisce about. Then there's some other storylines that maybe you didn't know that I didn't know that I get to know or get to relearn, and that's what's made this project so much fun. It's been a history lesson for us as a podcast and for you as an audience, and something I'm passionate about is being a caretaker of Carolina basketball history because it's storied. And it's important. And it's important for the next generation of fans to know just how truly special this program is. And that's what we're kind of learning as we go through the biggest what-ifs decade by decade. And next up, we'll get to the 1980s and get to talk about that first national championship for Coach Smith. But a lot of fun conversations in and around that decade will follow that as well. With that, guys, it is going to wrap up this edition of the show. In the meantime, we will direct you guys to the website. That's HeelToughBlog.com, your home for the best coverage of Carolina basketball, Tar Heel football. We were on the podcast earlier this week talking about Luka Bogovac setting his UNC arrival date. There's an article detailing that on the website as well. You can go check that out. Heavy focus on football. We're in the preseason, inside a month away from the opening kick of the year, and we're fully immersed in position previews. The offensive side of the football is taken care of. We've now turned our attention to the defensive side of the football. So make sure you get over, read all those position previews, the best in-depth breakdown of the Carolina football program, position by position. So make sure you get to the website every single day for the latest and the best coverage of Carolina basketball, Tar Heel football. As for the podcast, you guys know where to find us. Every major podcasting platform, simply search the Four Corners Podcast and we will pop up. There, we encourage you guys to rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any editions of the show throughout the remainder of the basketball off season. With that, that is going to wrap up this edition of the show. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening. I'd like Anthony for hosting with me as always, and go Tar